The mid-Pacific is a sapphire ocean, hot, humid, arched over by a blinding sky. From this void, the sun bends low, exerting its power so that sailormen broil in their own essential juices. Even 30 feet below the surface, depths where water is drawn for big ships' condensers, the ocean has a temperature of 85 degrees Fahrenheit. It is an almost opaque and intense Gulf Stream blue, the blue of vast deeps, and propellers whipping this dark water at racing speeds churn out wakes that float away to the horizon like dual ridges of snow. As was the case with other vessels braving the heat and deadly stifling moisture of the equatorial ocean's springtime last April, the Lexington's innards were almost as wet as was her outer hull. Droplets of saline crystal clinging to the steel plates outside the anti-torpedo bulges were matched by purer drops of nature's distillate that formed everywhere within her. The great man of war, 888 feet long, sweated like a man in a Turkish bath. Beads of moisture combined to form rivulets which forever coursed down floors, walls and roofs, the bulkheads, decks and side plates of this great floating city. Aboard the Lexington there was no relief from the heat and sweat. The Lexington, you must remember, was started as a battle cruiser and launched in 1925. As fighting ships go, she was old. She had none of the comforts of later carriers, cruisers and battleships. Air conditioning was not known when she was designed, and it never had been added because a fighting ship, especially in a war, is stripped down to her bare essentials. As a result, even the breath of the mechanical hurricane forever blowing through her bowels was hot and humid. While it changed the air within her, it did nothing to cool the interior or the crew. The scorching tropic sun sizzled on the flight decks, the island and the ship's anti-aircraft guns, bared so that they could search the skies in all directions around her. The deck plates, stanchions, gun barrels and breeches, railings and all the island's structure became so hot that flesh touching them was blistered. On deck, the normal forward progress of the big carrier, 20 knots or about 22.5 miles an hour, was enough to keep a strong breeze forever blowing. Even so, the temperatures on deck often reached 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Below, under the flight deck, where the crew's living quarters were situated, temperatures were over 100 degrees Fahrenheit from a few minutes after dawn until late at night. The coolest it ever got there was about 95 degrees. This, of course, was the result of the burning of thousands of gallons of fuel oil in the 16 huge boilers that supplied superheated steam for the Lexington's turbines. These turbines, moving electric motors, generated 209,000 horsepower, the most power ever put into any vessel, either of peace or war. The heat from these boilers, of course, was terrific. It started in the engine room plates and through the conductivity of the enormous steel hull, riveted and welded into one homogeneous mass spread throughout the ship. The hot seawater did little or nothing to reduce the temperatures. The result was that the Lexington's crew continually lived in sweat-soaked clothing and breathed and moved through a mist only slightly less moist than the element in which the mighty ship itself floated. In the engine rooms, the heat approached at all times the utmost limits of human endurance. With the blowers operating at their best, the temperatures ranged up toward 120 degrees Fahrenheit by day. At night, they dropped for a few hours to 112 degrees. Through even these temperatures, the engine room crews operated like the rest of the ship in shifts of 4 hours on and 4 off. 4 and 4, 4 and 4, white-faced engineers, and they throve on it. No suntan on their skins, yet they carried on with courage and quiet endurance. Perhaps I lay too much emphasis on the heat. Men of the Lexington, however, will not soon forget their campaigns in the tropic seas, nor the constant, forever irritating heat and sweat they endured. Soon after I went aboard the Lexington, I began to wonder what effect the heat had upon the personalities of the crew. At first I thought it strange that no effects were visible. No one was cantankerous. No one gave way to petty fault-finding, the military version of these minor hysterics in which some women indulge. Instead, the men were quiet, relaxed, and easy. There seemed no rough spots in the ship's routines, even though fully 1/5 of the men aboard were on their first cruise. After a time, I realized that in the Navy, where the numbers of men in the crew of even a big ship like the Lexington are relatively few compared to Army Corps or divisions, there is no place for prigs or pigs. Men must be good to hold their own. Anyone who lasts is good because the poorer material is weeded out. A ship's code of behavior is so enforced by custom, good sportsmanship, and the example of the ship's leaders, be they the immediate commanding officers or younger men whom the crew sees at closer range, that newcomers unconsciously fall into line. War is a serious business. It needs to be seriously studied and conducted, but it need not take all the fun out of life. I think I began to understand the Lexington and her crew best when we were 5 days out of Pearl Harbor last April 20th. 5 days and nights of steady steaming in the midst of our escort at a 20-knot pace had brought us close to the line, and it is here that we take up our story directly for the first time. The line is the equator, and in war or peace the American Navy makes its crossing an occasion for celebration whenever there are lowly polywogs aboard its ships. And when is there a ship without them? A lowly polywog is any person who 1. Has never crossed the line, 2. Has never genuflected to Neptunus Rex, or 3. Is in the unfortunate position of being unable to prove he has done either or both the above. Aboard the Lexington on this voyage, as mentioned already, were more than 500 raw recruits, all lowly polywogs. They ranged in age and rank from boys 17 and 18 years old to ensigns and young lieutenants who never had crossed into the realms of King Neptune. All, regardless of age and rank, were ripe material for the mild hazing which the initiations and homage to the sovereign and ubiquitous ruler of the raging main are wont to take. This time the initiations were to be unusually complete. All aboard were darkly told by the ancient shellbacks, those who could prove they had been initiated and had crossed the line. There was a special reason. It happened that on the voyage preceding this trip, the Lexington's crew had consisted of about 60% lowly polywogs. They had included not only enlisted men, but also officers up to the rank of commander. And the lowly polywogs had taken over the ship, contrary to all tradition and propriety, and soundly walloped the ancient shellbacks on the crossing day. Now the shellbacks, with appetites whetted, were to remove their dishonour by thoroughly initiating a new and well-outnumbered group of polywogs. The 5 days at sea had shaken the crew into ship routine. The new men had found their places as signalmen, anti-aircraft gunners, pilots and air gunners, as officers directing small gangs of men, air crewmen, as engineers, firemen, butchers, bakers, messmen, medical assistants, or as clerks. They had become part of the ship's community. But any unity, any friendship that had developed was temporarily shattered when the ancient shellbacks began to ferret out the polywogs. Even in matters of pure fun, naval tradition calls for an orderly process. So it is with the ancient rites. Each mess, or each department on the ship, handles its own polywogs in preliminary ceremonies that take place on the 2 evenings just prior to crossing day. At these hearings, the polywogs, regardless of rank or station, are put through early tortures, are indoctrinated with respect for the court, invariably a group of, for the occasion, sadistic old-timers, and are generally browbeaten and robbed of small sums of money to provide cigarettes, Coca-Cola, candy bars, or ice cream, which is avidly devoured by the waiting shellback pack. Every preliminary court is headed by a Grand Inquisitor, a direct representative of Neptune. He is flanked by a scribe, Davy Jones's helper, for Davy is King Neptune's personal scribe. Around the court gather self-appointed fellow inquisitors, tormentors, kibitzers, and those whom the Navy knows as nibitzers. A kibitzer, of course, is one who peers over the shoulder of an active player in any game and contributes unhelpful suggestions, a low fellow. A nibitzer is the lowest form of kibitzer, so low, in fact, that 3 nibitzers, each standing on the other's shoulders, can pass beneath a snake without knocking off the highest man's tall hat. Collection of the polywogs' names began early all over the ship. The first ceremonies were held on the 2nd evening before the ship was due to reach the crossing point. I watched the gathering in the mess, headed by the executive officer, Commander Mort Seligman, an old Navy test pilot who began his Navy career by commanding a trawler that helped in the great sweeping up of mines from the North Sea after World War I. The mess was 2 decks below the flight deck, about amidships. In it were 6 long tables with seats for 22 men each. The room was almost square. Walls, ceiling and floor were painted white. Tables and chairs were of dark wood. For dinner, the evening meal, the officers wore white ducks and the high-collared Navy jacket, which, if cut loosely and worn without shirt or singlet beneath, is as comfortable a garment, if the stiff high collar is left open, as one can wear under these conditions. We were of all ages, from the early 20s to the late 50s, some deeply tanned, some with the pallor of tween-deck workers. We were lean, fat, stocky, and slender. It was a meal in which there was much good-natured repartee. After the mess, boys had served the confection and coffee, the tables were cleared quickly, and the senior table, in the centre of the starboard end of the wardroom, transformed into the bar of Neptune's court. I remember the scene well. All of us looked on with expectant amusement as the court formed. We pulled back our chairs, all 130-odd of us, and settled over cigarettes or pipes. Commander Walter Gilmore, big, heavy, jovial, with greying hair and an office paleness to his cheeks, assumed the exaggerated character of Grand Inquisitor. His jury, as prejudiced a group of shellbacks as ever convicted a pollywog, surrounded him. Commander Arthur J. White, senior surgeon aboard the Lexington, was assistant kibitzer. Quiet, slender, easy-going, with a humour that hid behind a poker face and his ever-glowing pipe, the doctor was a dangerous man to have interjecting rapier questions, which is the duty of a good kibitzer. At his right was Group Commander William Alt, senior aviation officer aboard ship. He was 6'2" of whipcord. More than 50 years rested lightly on his shoulders. His thin, long face was deeply tanned. A pair of sharp eyes drilled you when he peered your way, yet he was easy, friendly. Now his lips twisted in an anticipatory smile that bode ill for the accused who must come before him. Bill Alt had been a Navy pilot for 20 years, and still was active leader of the ship's air squadrons. In attacks he led a command group of 4 planes and used to dive-bomb himself. His leadership was of the highest sort leadership which led. The Navy had recognized it by ordering him to report as commander of one of the new converted aircraft carriers when next the Lexington made port. Alas, the Lexington did not make it, and Bill Alt too is among the missing. When last we heard from him, by radio about noon on May 8th, he told us that he and his gunner had been hit by Japanese bullets, and their plane was shot to pieces around them. Bill said they were going down in the sea, somewhere along that 200 miles of ocean between us and the enemy. When he radioed us, he was returning after having led the Lexington squadrons in the ship's last great fight, but that was weeks ahead, and none of us were thinking of the future that night. The rest of the jury consisted of Lieutenant Commander Weldon Hamilton, skipper of the Lexington's 18 dive bombers, Lieutenant Commander Bob Dixon, skipper of the Scout Bomber Squadron, Commander Heine Junkers, the squat, powerful chief engineer, as purposeful in his quiet way as his 4 huge engines. All were seasoned men, sure of their own abilities, accustomed to command. Hamilton, with his wavy black hair, was perhaps the handsomest of the trio. Dixon, quiet, precise, with a body trained down fine like a prize-winning athlete, and with an air of do-or-die determination about him, was the personification of a Navy airman. Because this was the senior officers' mess, with virtually no victims from its own tables, the young pilots and a dozen or more young ensigns and junior-grade lieutenants from the junior officers' mess were called before this court. These young pilots, only a couple of months out of the Navy Air School at Pensacola, Florida, and the other young officers were a keen, trim lot. Disciplined, yet headstrong and likely to take attack of their own, they made wonderful victims. One of the first was Ensign Lee, tall, poised, good-looking, and one of the better jitterbugs, as my vision of him dancing at various Honolulu night spots before the voyage started bore out. Mr. Lee made a bold decision when his name was called, and he positively swaggered as he strode before the bar. "Have you ever crossed the line?" came the question of the Grand Inquisitor. Brazenly the young man asked, "What line?" Snarls of rage rose from the assembled shellbacks. Groans, hoots, and denunciations. Here was an impudent young pollywog poking fun at the royal presence. Even Lee's stout heart must have had misgivings as he saw the results of his defiance. Covering their delight with melodramatic frowns of evil intent, the jury demanded, "What line do you think?" "Oh," was Lee's reply, "if you are referring to that highly imaginary line, that line that no one has ever been able to see, that line that holds in the Earth's waistband, that is supposed to be somewhere around here, then I have never crossed it." More snarls, groans, moans of anguish rose, mutterings of mutiny. He takes liberties with the royal domain, then sneers at the old salts, and similar remarks in undertones were heard. With merely a glance at his exercised jury, each man was gesticulating, shouting, asking some question that was lost in the general turmoil and confusion. Inquisitor Gilmore instantly found Lee guilty of being the lowliest pollywog. He was dismissed as the court's decision was acclaimed. The dismissal, however, was granted with instructions to appear before the court on the morrow, prepared to pay penalties and forfeits for his conduct. The court went on for hours. Some pollywogs adopted the most abject attitudes. They were promptly stepped upon hard, told off for lack of backbone, denounced as spineless and worthless pollywogs. Others followed Lee's example. They were browbeaten into a state of dejection, declared to be mutinous, denounced as lacking in respect and reverence for the supreme and omnipotent ruler of the sea, and condemned. It was soon apparent that the court and jury were sitting with one purpose in view, to convict and condemn any and all. It was an inquisition in which justice and right were totally absent, in which the prisoner had no rights, hopes, or chances of escape. But it was all in fun. You may be very sure my own case was soon called. I had heard something of what was coming, and had made certain preparations. There had been outspoken glee over the opportunity of initiating a newspaper correspondent. I had been warned that I was to get the works, in fact, and I had helped things along by appearing very ignorant of what was coming. When I was called that first night, I had my documents ready, and I startled the court by promptly claiming my rights and putting my foot on the court's table. By this I indicated I had crossed the line in the Pacific, the Atlantic, and Indian Oceans. In fact, line crossing has been something I have been doing frequently ever since I was born. The court was most reluctant to accept my proof, and my papers were scrutinized for flaws. Eventually, however, I was recognized as a shellback to the disappointment of all in the room. My rating was such that I took my place at the judgment table as assistant scribe. "Lieutenant Commander Paul Ramsay faced the court," intoned the scribe. Ramsay, skipper of the Lexington's fighter squadron, had been sitting in the crowd enjoying the spectacle. Confident in his own knowledge that he had long ago qualified as a shellback, he kibitzed, shooting in cunning questions from time to nonplus hapless defendants. The call surprised him, startled him out of his usual debonair poise. Rising quickly, he glanced up and down the forbidding line of faces glaring now at him, raised his expressive eyebrows, and with exaggerated innocence demanded, "Who? Me? Not me," all the while tapping his chest with his index finger. "Yes, you. You heard. Take the stand," came the Grand Inquisitor's stern voice. Quickly appraising the situation and deciding that he was in for trouble, Ramsay stepped forward to meet it, gave his long handlebar moustache a cavalier twirl, and awaited the inevitable questions. That moustache was the result of a vow taken weeks earlier that he would not shave his upper lip until his guns had shot at least 2 Japanese from the sky. Later, after a wet dinner just before the cruise started, Paul raised his sights rashly to 10, 5 for a side. Tonight this fungus had reached gigantic proportions, and from constant twirling stuck out on both sides of his face in a fashion reminiscent of the horns of a Texas steer. Ramsay was a serious and efficient fighting man who exercised his squadron constantly and prepared every man for the air battles that fighter units seek. His presence and that of his squadron aboard the Lexington indicated that he was highly rated by his superiors. But when he was off duty, as now, he was a delightful shipmate. His penchant for jest and his ability to turn the sharpest thrusts against their originators made him a constant target in the mess. Consequently, the packed wardroom waited with amused expectancy for the bout of wits they expected forthwith. Paul, standing without a trace of egotism but with a twinkle of expectancy in his eye, was at his best. The court, realizing that here they had a prisoner who would hand back as much as he received, consulted momentarily in a huddle of heads before commencing the inquisition. "Before charging you with being a low, despised pollywog, we ask if you would like the court's defense counsel to act as prisoner's friend. We feel you are entitled to this protection," Commander Gilmore began smoothly. "But I do not," Ramsay replied. "If I am going to hang, I will say the things that hang me myself. I do not want any assistance from this court's prejudiced, iniquitous, perfidious, backstabling counsel." To this the court reacted like a group of politicians caught with their collective fists in the pork barrel. Eventually, however, they quieted, ceased defending themselves by casting reflections on Ramsay's ancestors, and proceeded to give the victim the business. "We understand you claim to have crossed the line, and further that you have been telling unsuspecting ensigns that you are a fully rated shellback." Gilmore made it sound like a charge. "Yes, of course. It is perfectly true I am," Ramsay replied. "Have you any written document to prove that you crossed the line and were duly initiated into the mysteries of the raging main?" Ramsay's face reflected his anguish. He suddenly remembered he had no such document aboard. Knowing and rightfully fearing the penalties that would be assessed him, he began casting about for a way out. "Why, no, I have not documentary proof," he mumbled. "But I did cross the line aboard the Wyoming in such and such a year, as everyone knows." "We are not interested in what everyone knows. But perhaps there is someone here, some friend, for example, who will stand out and vouch for you. Remember, this friend, assuming you have even one, must be a proven shellback." This is an ancient snare, as Ramsay well knew, but he was desperate. Turning and surveying the wardroom, he sought some shipmate from the Wyoming's cruise. His eye settled on Commander Duckworth, air officer on the staff of the Lexington's skipper, Captain Fred Sherman. "Ducky, you can vouch for me. We were together on that cruise, remember?" "I never saw the prisoner before this moment," Duckworth, with straight face, informed the Grand Inquisitor as the crowd jeered Ramsay. Ramsay's case seemed to parallel the rest. Once called, no quarter was given. Paul saw he was beaten, temporarily at least, and he threw himself on the dubious mercy of the court. Of course the jury took the position that he had attempted to foist himself off as a shellback under false pretenses, a serious matter, they assured him. He was dismissed with orders to present himself the next evening for sentence. During the next few hours, Ramsay spent most of his time in the Lexington's library, where he went hunting for ships' lists and rosters of crews on various vessels. After a 3-hour research, he dug up a Navy list that proved beyond doubt he was aboard the Wyoming when she crossed the equator. Next evening he presented this incontrovertible document, and thus evaded the difficulties he was certain would overwhelm him on crossing day. When the shellbacks had finished that night, they were assured of a goodly number of choice polywogs for the coming Roman holiday. Those of us who had been given charges to prepare long indictments of specific polywogs burnt midnight kilowatts in our cabins concocting dire, involved, and tongue-twisting calumnies. All were designed to show what a base and worthless individual a lowly polywog is on the night before his initiation. The second night's fun consisted of repeating the wardroom court scene. This time no proof was being requested. Every victim was called before the court to receive penalties. These were of the wildest and most bizarre sort. The pockets of the victims were hit slightly, all the old shellbacks sweltering down there having developed enormous thirsts for soft drinks and ice cream. Everyone was watching the words and demeanour of the victims to discover a case of contempt of court. Practically anything was contempt of court. Commander Gilmore would say, "Look at him, standing there with collar unbuttoned, shoes not polished, no crease in the pants, tie not straight. Lounging, eh? Has table number 2 got plenty of coke over there? No? Supply a round of coke for table number 2. There are only 2 dozen there." The next victim might be one of the young pilots. "Oh, ho, a pilot." The commander's words dripped scorn. "Why aren't you wearing your fur-lined flying jacket? In fact, it might be a good idea to put your entire winter suit on, pants, boots, jacket, helmet, gloves, then come back and report to us." The poor victim would disappear, and then come back dressed, and with the perspiration already coursing down his face. He would then take his place in the line waiting for the court's disposition, but strangely enough he would be entirely invisible to the Grand Inquisitor for perhaps an hour. It would be a period of very real torment, but of course did no harm except to the victim's self-esteem, if any. During the first night of interrogation, one young ensign made the serious tactical error of admitting before the bar that he was attached to the ship's naval intelligence. That was greeted with hoots, jeers, and howls, for every shellback knows there is no such thing. When he reappeared that second night, he was greeted thus: "Oh, here is the young intelligence officer." There was a hurried, whispered conversation at the court table. Then, "Young man, what do you do with the colour-headed pins you use on the charts?" A question revealing that the questioner knew his job well. That is a naval secret. The young man was doing pretty well. Right, then go and get a large box of them and bring them here. This young man was called to the front of the line as soon as he reappeared, and the questioning was instantly resumed. So, you are in naval intelligence? Then you would know of all the countries in the world? Well, yes. Then make a large map of Australia on the left side of your coat using those pins for the outline. No, do not take the jacket off, leave it on. We do not mind if you prick yourself occasionally. Halfway through, someone said, "What are you doing?" "Making an outline of Australia," was the surprised rejoinder. There was a babble from the table. "It is upside down. It is wrong way round. It is not straight. You have got north pointing downward." Finally, it was agreed to let him proceed according to his own pattern. As one of the jury sadly remarked, what more could be expected from a naval intelligencer? When he stopped pinning himself and looked up, there was a lot of criticism as to the outline, and he was rigorously cross-examined on the location of harbours, rivers, the Great Barrier Reef, and other points. Finally, a very confused, embarrassed, heated, and futile young man was allowed to buy a gallon of ice cream for one of the tables before being turned over to two shellbacks who would prepare him for and see him through his initiation. The court closed that night with appetites whetted anew for the initiation proper of the morrow. It began for some of the poor Pollies before dawn. Coming in for breakfast, I ran into the first of them. Two ensigns clotted and blacked as minstrel singers were presenting themselves as I entered. Each had a special little chore of his own, which had to be repeated in every department of the ship. One had to enter, bow, and then sing "I Love You." The other was required to declaim an involved and highly suitable poem. It was a poem about a man with a wheelbarrow, a hoe and a plough, but we never did get the sense of it because of the singing that drowned out part of the performance. The two acts, it seemed, had to be done together. Ensign H.B. Schonk followed them at close range. He wore short whites, a singlet with shoulder boards indicating he carried the rank of commander, and a paper Napoleon hat. Round his neck was a rope carrying two Coca-Cola bottles lashed together for an imaginary set of binoculars. His act was to peer around all points of the compass and into every corner of the ship, and then report, "No enemy aircraft in there." Poor Schonk, he was busy doing this all morning long. He was a good victim, however. Schonk, it turned out, was an off-the-arm poet. He evened his scores with the various shellbacks long before the voyage was over by his poetical castigations. You must not forget that despite all the surface horseplay, the Lexington was a ship of war coursing toward enemy waters. Half of her company was constantly on duty as usual. Not a whit of vigilance was ever relaxed. The air patrols went off regularly. The radio department was as diligent as ever. The engineers and gunners were at their posts. But it was amazing how it happened that not one of the pollywogs found himself doing watch that morning. Somehow this was the case no matter where they were assigned on the ship. What came next convinced me that no one should ever cross the line for the first time aboard an aircraft carrier. The flight deck is far too long, and the deck personnel, not to mention the rest of the ship's company, by far too numerous. I say this because the final act of the initiation ceremonies was to run the gauntlet from one end of the ship to the other, between two lines of husky, healthy young Americans, each of whom took a lusty whack at your posterior with a canvas tube stuffed with wet paper. This, I assure you, makes quite an effective flail, especially when multiplied by 500 over the period of time it takes you to run 800 feet. Every pollywog's initiation wound up that way. But before this grand finale, each man is called before the royal court. Up forward, King Neptune, the Queen, and the royal baby, invariably the fattest man on the ship, are ensconced on their thrones. They come aboard with all the ceremonies granted a reigning monarch early in the day, and throughout the forenoon welcome the newcomers. Each victim is led before the king, stripped more or less. Then come forward vassals of the court who wield brushes dipped into strange pigments, egg yolk, shellac, iodine, banana oil, lemon extract, and other even stranger and more mysterious concoctions. These pigments are used to anoint the bodies of the now nearly shell-backed pollywogs. Strange devices, heraldry, and mystic symbols are embossed on their torsos. They make their final genuflections, go down on their knees, and then commence their run. Usually they start with their belts unbuckled by the foresight of the high priests. The result is that they stagger and stumble down the lines of men. For much of this I stood on the signal bridge, 25 feet above the deck. From there I could see each shellback rear back, swing and hear the plock as the various blows got home. One short, stocky marine about halfway down the line had a beautiful backhand stroke that seemed to snap with unusual vigour. The runners would hold a steady pace until even with him. Then his arm would sweep around, his wrist would flick, and with a yell of momentary agony the unhappy runner gave a great leap, thereafter to increase his speed. "On carriers in non-wartime," Ensign Hansen, the ship's signal officer who stood beside me, said, "we had a fine old practice. It used to frighten the wits out of even the boldest. It involved using the main airplane elevators that bring the planes from deep inside the ship up to the flight deck. The shellbacks would rig a huge canvas tank of water on the elevator and then lower the lift at its deepest, about 70 feet below the flight deck. The polywogs would be led to the edge of this chasm and ordered to peer well into the water tank below them. They would be led away, more ceremony would follow, whereupon they were blindfolded and immediately led back to the edge of the elevator. There they were told that the tank was below them and ordered to jump in. Still blindfolded as they were, there was almost none who went voluntarily. Usually they had to be pushed. Of course, while they had been away from the elevator, it had been brought up until it was only 5 or 6 feet below the flight deck, but the victims did not know that. There would be great shrieks as each fell, and they almost always got great gulps of water, because they hit with a splash after falling only a fraction of a second. This gentle practice was suspended for the duration aboard the Lexington because her planes and elevators were kept ready for instant action. From the Lexington's bridge I looked out over our task force and could see that aboard every other vessel homage was being paid the ruler of the raging main. Aboard the cruisers and destroyers with us at this time, scenes quite similar to those aboard the Lexington were being enacted. When I went below for lunch, I ran into my cabin boy, Duke, a slender, happy-go-lucky Negro youth from Harlem. He had joined on in New York, where he had worked with a band. He was a most intelligent and enthusiastic youngster who spent his spare time playing his accordion. It was his hot musical style that had won him the name Duke, after the Duke Ellington. "How's it feel to be a shellback, Duke?" I asked him. "Well, sir, they certainly poured it into me," he replied, massaging his bruises. "Several of those boys in that line up there certainly is hot with them flagellators. I won't be able to sit down for some days." "Never mind. Think of it. Next time you cross the line, you will be with the shellbacks passing it on to the polywogs." Can't hardly wait for that time." He flashed his teeth at me. "I will be right there handing it out." Neither of us could know that the Duke had just crossed the line for the first and last time. As the United States ship Lexington ploughed across the line that white-hot morning, she was carrying the hopes, dreams, achievements and contributions of a whole generation of Navy airmen. The Lexington and her sister ship, the Saratoga, were the floating laboratories through which our own Navy and the Japanese had learned how to equip and then how to operate seaborne aviation. Exercises with these two great ships first taught our Navy leaders the potentialities of the airstriking force and exerted tremendous influence upon the design of all other fleet vessels. In other words, it was the Lexington and Saratoga that transformed the whole concept of naval warfare. The flight decks of these vessels brought about the greatest advance in the art of sea fighting since the addition of armor and steam to warships. But on that morning, just about a week out of Pearl Harbor, I did not know the Lexington's history. That was to come later, after hours spent in the ship's library, and after I had attended dozens of lectures at which the strategy of carrier fighting and Navy sea and air tactics were unfolded for her young pilots. I discovered after some research, with the assistance of the ship's executive officer, Commander Mort Seligman, that our Lexington was the fourth ship of the United States Navy to bear this name. There was little enough available concerning her predecessors, but we found that the first Lexington was a brig of 16 guns, the second a sloop of war with 18 guns, and the third was a sidewheel ironclad steamer of Civil War vintage. She was a shallow-draft vessel for navigating inland rivers, I believe with 7 guns. The present Lexington was our first really big aircraft carrier. She was a floating aviation field. Her 900 feet of flight deck, extending from her bow to her stern, formed a runway that could be turned into wind from any direction. and her great motors could be used to create a mechanical wind over her deck by driving her at any desired speed up to 33.9 knots or 38 miles an hour roughly. Even on a calm day, the airflow along the Lexington's deck, when she was merely cruising, was equal to that of a brisk wind on a flying field ashore. Best of all, she was a mobile field. Under her own power, the Lexington could cover more than 700 miles in a single day and night. In her first long sea run, from San Pedro, California to Honolulu on June 9th to 12th, 1928, she covered 2,228 nautical miles in 74 hours 34 minutes. On that voyage, she averaged 30.7 nautical miles, 34 land miles an hour, including the first hours during which she was gradually accelerating to full speed. Below the flight deck was the hangar deck where her planes could be stored. Then there were the engine and plane overhaul shops, storerooms, motor test rooms, fabric departments, parachute rooms, and all the other shops and stores necessary to the equipment of a complete military airbase. Giant elevators, fore and aft, could raise or lower complete planes from these inner storage or ship spaces to the flight deck. When raised until flush with the rest of the flight deck, the elevator platform formed part of a complete and unbroken surface from bow to stern. The Lexington originally was one of 6 battle cruisers included in the 3-year building program authorized August 29, 1916. The original contract for her hull and machinery was signed on April 20, 1917, but work on her was not started until 1920, due to the entry of the United States into World War I. As one of these cruisers, the Lexington was being designed for both great speed and heavy guns, a sort of American counterpart of the British battlecruiser Hood. Her planned tonnage was 43,500, the approximate weight she displaced at the time she finally was sunk in the Coral Sea. The Lexington was about 1/3 finished, and the Saratoga a little further along, when the Washington Limitation of Armament Conference was called late in 1921. By treaty during this conference, the United States called off its tremendous Navy building program, and at first all 6 of the battle cruisers were ordered abandoned or scrapped. The late William A. Moffett, one of the Navy's first leaders to believe in the future importance of aircraft, had just been made an admiral, and had succeeded a few months before the Armament Conference opened in organizing the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics, which even today handles all Navy aviation affairs. Through Admiral Moffett's personal influence, the first 2 of the battle cruisers were saved for what generally was understood to be experimental service after conversion to carriers. A supplementary contract for the conversion was signed in the case of the Lexington on November 2, 1922, and the work was recommenced. The long delay between authorization of the conversion and the contract signing was caused by the redesigning of the entire interior of the Lexington and Saratoga, as the Navy soon came to know them. All the superstructure planned earlier for the battlecruiser had to be eliminated, and the smokestack, bridge, and navigating offices of the vessel were concentrated in an island raised above the flight deck and placed on the starboard side. Tankage for aviation gasoline, for oil, and for water was placed on the port side to offset the weight of the island, and the 4 pairs of 8-inch guns which were mounted off-center to starboard. In order to make the Lexington virtually unsinkable, the interior was elaborately compartmented. In all, there were more than 600 separate compartments, each of which could be locked from the others by watertight bulkheads, steel scuttle hatches, and heavy doors. Of these compartments, 117 were assigned to the supply department of the vessel. 31 were set aside for storage of technical aviation material, 70 for general ship stores, equipage, and provisions. 16 compartments were utilized for galleys, bakery, butcher shop, general mess, issue room, clothing issue room, and the ship's store or canteen. Part of Admiral Moffett's conception was that all aircraft carriers should be fast, long-range vessels. Therefore, the Lexington's original battlecruiser propulsion machinery was retained. This consisted of 16 big oil-fired steam boilers supplying power for 4 electric turbine generator sets, each designed to produce 33,200 kilowatts per hour. These 4 generating sets were linked to 8 big motors, which in turn were paired on the 4 propeller shafts. The designers intended that a total of 45,000 horsepower should be delivered to each shaft, enough to turn the huge water screws 317 revolutions per minute. Subsidiary power plants consisted of 6 750-kilowatt direct current turbine generator sets. This equipment operated the steering gear, anchor windlass, ventilation fans, lighting systems, radio, telephone, telegraph and electric pumps distributed throughout the ship. The elevators, searchlights, fire alarm systems, cooking apparatus, refrigeration, ammunition hoists and other special and secret apparatus were electrically operated. I am including these details here because they contribute directly to a better understanding of the events immediately preceding the great old ship's end, an end that came less than 3 weeks after we passed the equator. The Lexington's earliest trials disclosed that her propulsion equipment, produced by the General Electric Company, exceeded design specifications materially by 29,000 horsepower in fact. Instead of 180,000 horsepower, her turbines and motors delivered 209,000 horsepower, more, as I said before, than that of any other vessel except the Saratoga. With all this power, the Lexington's great bulk and breadth, 888 feet long by 106 feet wide, could be maneuvered almost as readily as a destroyer 1/20th of her weight. Armament of the Lexington originally included 8 8-inch rifles. These were in heavy turrets fore and aft of the island, which was a combined bridge, funnel enclosure, masts, range-finding and radio tower, and ventilation outlet. By 1941, however, these turrets, with their heavy guns, which were only approximations of a cruiser's arms, were removed. The Navy had officially decided that the Lexington's airplanes alone were sufficiently powerful offensive weapons. This was, of course, before we were in the war, and before the correctness of the Navy's theories were proved in battle. I was particularly interested in the removal of the turrets later on because a 1,000-pound Japanese bomb skimmed the flight deck a few feet ahead of the bridge, barely cleared the starboard rail, and exploded in the sea alongside us. Its explosion shook the Lexington and drenched all of us on the bridge with an enormous column of seawater. That bomb, had the turrets been retained, would have struck flush on the top of the forward barbette and probably would have destroyed the island, the entire operating centre of the ship, and, incidentally, me. For defensive arms, the Lexington's commanders had adopted the British and German systems. They literally made her a pincushion of small, rapid-fire anti-aircraft guns. These were of 2 calibers, 20mm and 1.1 inches. In all, more than 100 of these were spotted around the ship in batteries of 4. Each unit was commanded by a young gunnery officer whose sole duty in battle was to keep his own particular segment of the sky clear of enemy planes. In addition to the light, quick-firing machine guns, as the 20mm and 37mm guns are called by the Navy, the Lexington retained her batteries of 5-inch dual-purpose anti-torpedo plane, anti-high-altitude aircraft guns. These were disposed at bow and stern on each side in units of 3. The small gun batteries were all manned by sailors, and sailor crews operated half the 5-inch batteries. Marine crews had charge of the other 6 5-inches, and the healthy rivalry between the 2 units in practice shoots sure was something to behold. But I am getting a little ahead of myself. I want to return to that period in the Navy just prior to the commissioning of the Lexington. While yet a captain, William Moffat became interested in naval aviation and gathered around him a group of younger officers whose technical knowledge assisted him in evaluating air possibilities. When he became an admiral, he assigned some of these younger officers to develop special types of places and engines for carrier work, special catapult mechanisms for ships, and commenced work on the Navy's still-secret arresting gear to assist planes in alighting on carrier decks. One of these younger officers was E. Wilson, then aviation aide to the Commander-in-Chief of the Battle Fleet. Mr. Wilson, who had reached rank of commander when he resigned in 1930, now is president of United Aircraft Corporation. He grew up in naval aviation, according to his own words. Recently he wrote me a long and informative letter showing in brief, but most illuminatingly, his personal recollections of those important years in which this new arm was coming of age. I am going to quote extensively from this letter, which paints the men and the times. In World War I, Mr. Wilson wrote, I was chief engineer of the battleship Arkansas in the North Sea. My ship was based in the Firth of Forth, and near us were anchored the great British carriers. The one thing the British Grand Fleet feared at that time was that the Germans would discover the possibilities of the torpedo plane, which the British had pioneered during the early years of the war, Lord Beatty, who then was commander of the battlecruiser squadron, took every precaution against possible German use of this weapon. He had several large carriers in active commission. These carriers, with their airplanes, and the land planes that were carried above the battleship and battlecruiser turrets, were simply a counter against the possibility that the Germans might have land-based torpedo planes, Mr. Wilson writes. He says that had the Germans had shore-based torpedo-carrying aircraft at the time of the Battle of Jutland, they could easily have taken part in the action. It was fought near enough to German territory. Sopwith Camels, very light land fighter planes, were used for takeoffs from the battleship turrets. These practiced at fields ashore and were ferried alongside the vessels and hoisted to the turret tops before the fleet went to sea, Mr. Wilson adds. They retained the wheels for alighting on land, and it was these planes and practices together with the British carrier program that were the inspiration for our carrier force, he claims. American naval aviation centered in some anti-submarine patrol work on what was called the Northern Bombing Force. This was commanded by Kenneth Whiting, now Captain, United States Navy, Inspector of the Eastern District, New York City. Whiting was one of the earliest Navy pilots and was fully alive to the British carrier development. To a great extent, he is the father of the American carrier program. He sent Lieutenant Godfrey de Chevalier to Rosyth, Scotland, to observe British carrier tactics, and de Chevalier was berthed on my ship. This aroused my interest in the new activity, so when the war was over and I came home, I got an assignment at the Naval Training Station at Great Lakes as officer in charge of the Naval Aviation Mechanics School. Such schools had been established all over the United States by the Bureau of Navigation under the direction of Dr. Charles E. Luck of Columbia University, one of the engineering consultants for my company today. The Navy Department decided to concentrate these schools at Great Lakes in order to train several thousand men required to replace the wartime force discharged to their homes. I commanded this school for 2 years and then went to sea on the United States shipwright, the first Navy seaplane tender. Captain William A. Moffett had been commandant of the Great Lakes Station, as everyone in the Middle West knows. He had become much interested in naval aviation. After the war, he went on duty as captain of the Mississippi, but went back to Washington in 1921 for the avowed purpose of establishing a Naval Bureau of Aeronautics. On his way, he stopped in to see me at Great Lakes and asked me to join him in the Bureau, but I had to go to sea to qualify. So, after the Great Lakes tour, I put the Wright in commission as a kite balloon ship and plane tender at New York. I served on her a year, mostly in the Caribbean, and this was the beginning of our patrol schedule based on seaplane tenders. Meanwhile, Admiral Moffett had succeeded in getting the Bureau of Aeronautics organized. I went to sea on the Bridgeport as executive officer to qualify for executive duty, and in March 1924 was ordered to the Bureau in charge of the engine section. Lieutenant Commander B.G. Layton, since retired and now managing the Intercontinental Aircraft Corporation at Miami, had the engine section and was busily engaged in developing the air-cooled radial engine. I took over this duty and pushed the development to the point where we had 2 competent companies, Wright Aeronautical and Pratt & Whitney Aircraft, in production on such engines. The fundamental problem in the carrier development was to get the maximum number of aircraft in the relatively small space offered by carrier accommodations. The cooling system of the liquid-cooled engine meant additional weight, which in turn increased the size of the airplane and reduced carrier capacity. That story alone is an interesting one. In the Bureau at the time was Kenneth Whiting, now a captain and in charge of the carrier program. The Washington Arms Conference had scrapped most of the new vessels, but Admiral Moffett had managed to save the Lexington and Saratoga for conversion to carriers. Meanwhile, Ken Whiting had succeeded in converting the Langley for experimental purposes. The Bureau was very busy developing the special type of airplanes needed for the carriers, including fighter, torpedo, and bomber planes. After the engine development had progressed considerably, I went to Pensacola, received my wings, and returned in charge to the design section of the Bureau. There I had the opportunity of supervising the completion of the new aircraft around the air-cooled engines intended for the carriers. In October 1927, I was assigned to the Aircraft Squadron Battle Fleet at San Diego, as senior aide or chief of staff to Rear Admiral Joseph M. Reeves, now retired but in Washington as liaison between the Navy and the Maritime Commission. Serving with me on the staff was Captain Frank D. Wagner, now in the Bureau of Aeronautics of the Navy Department as operations officer. Wagner was a combat pilot, and I know of no one more competent than he in the field of aircraft operations and air tactics. When I arrived in San Diego, Captain J. H. Towers, now Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, was captain of the Langley, and this was our only carrier, and on which Admiral Reeves had been training the air squadrons scheduled to go aboard the Saratoga and Lexington when they ultimately joined the fleet. In 1928, we made a cruise to Hawaii on a fleet problem. At that time, the Langley actually carried 42 of the new Boeing fighters and Vought observation airplanes, and we carried out an attack against Hawaii that in many ways resembled the Japanese action at Pearl Harbor. The Lexington joined us and became our flagship for the return to San Diego, and later the Saratoga joined us. We spent a year in the development of our carrier tactics, training of the crews, and in tactical exercises with the fleet. In the autumn of 1928, Admiral William Vesey Pratt, then Commander-in-Chief, but now writing for a news magazine, sent out the usual fleet problem as the basis of operations for the next year, 1929. This included an attack on the Panama Canal. Admiral Reeves, in his estimate of the situation, proposed that we abandon the usual stereotyped battleship operation and detach the Saratoga on a wide southerly detour, with instructions to run the gauntlet of the defending forces and attack the canal, launching aircraft at a distance of 200 miles. When the Commander-in-Chief's new orders came out, there was no mention of this new idea. Therefore, the Admiral and his staff flew in 3 airplanes to San Pedro to call on the Commander-in-Chief. I had Admiral Reeves as my passenger. We went aboard the California to see Admiral Pratt, and Admiral Reeves outlined his plan. He pointed out to Admiral Pratt that we had succeeded in developing an entirely new task force. He coined the phrase at that time, the Carrier Striking Force, and gave Admiral Pratt a detailed plan for the approach. Most of these details had been worked out by Captain Wagner. Admiral Pratt was much impressed. He said that he would adopt the suggestion, but instead of changing the orders which were already out, he would put to sea and make the change en route to Panama. This would give us the benefit of an exercise in complete change in orders. Before doing so, however, he pointed out to Admiral Reeves that if we were to lose any pilots in this long-range operation, it would go hard with the command. Admiral Reeves replied, "Our record for the past year discloses no mechanical failures in many hours of overwater operations. Our experience indicates that we need expect no such thing as mechanical failures and pilot losses against Panama, and the risk is therefore warranted." Under the general plan of the problem, the Langley, Lexington and Wright were assigned to defending forces. There were also shore-based aircraft and the military in the Panama Canal zone. The Saratoga was the only carrier in the attacking force, supposed to represent a Japanese fleet. We put to sea according to schedule and down the Mexican coast, stopping in the middle of the day. Our vessel sent boats to the flagship for guard mail, and the guard mail contained the new orders. One of the problems was that there was no destroyer at that time able to keep pace with the Saratoga on this long high-speed run. The Omaha, flagship of the commander of the destroyer division, Admiral Sen, was therefore detached to act as a plane guard for the Saratoga. Admiral Sen flew his flag on the Omaha, and Captain Stark, until recently Chief of Naval Operations, was his Chief of Staff. We had the extraordinary situation of a senior admiral plane guarding the flagship of a junior admiral. The Saratoga went far to the south and west, in the direction of the Galapagos Islands, and began the approach to the canal at 30 knots. 24 hours before the attack, we were nearly 1,000 miles from the canal, and even though there is a cul-de-sac on the Pacific side, this spread the defending vessels very thin. The weather was squally during daylight, so there was no need to send aircraft in the air. However, at the end of the day the weather cleared and we launched some of the fighters. Almost immediately they reported the destroyer Breck as in contact. Meanwhile, the Saratoga had run the Omaha out of fuel, and that vessel had slowed down. My chief worry was what to do about a plane guard vessel for the attack in the morning. Just at this moment occurred one of those extraordinary incidents that disclose the fortunes of war. We were all standing on the bridge, watching the Breck approach, when the chief signal quartermaster said to the admiral, "I think the Breck thinks we are the Lexington." The admiral said, "Well, what will we do with her?" And I said, Let us tell him to plane guard us." Instantly the Admiral gave the signal. As the flags reached the yardarm, the Breck swung into position and took her plane guard station directly astern, where we promptly disabled her. Later, she reported having rigged a jury radio and notified the enemy of our approach. Just at dark, the cruiser Detroit, with Captain R. Drace White, now with the Budd Manufacturing Company, suspected what we were doing and deviated from its scouting station and picked us up. He trailed us all night long, waving his searchlights in the air and urging the enemy to concentrate on us. During the night, our squadron commander was concerned lest we be caught on the deck, that is, hostile planes surprise attack while our squadron's on deck instead of in the air, and suggested to Admiral Reeves that he launch ahead of time. We had planned to launch 2 hours before daylight. I felt, however, we should not change the plan, and we stood on. We launched aircraft on schedule, 200 miles at sea. The details of this are most interesting, but I won't list them here. Suffice it to say that our aircraft delivered the attack on the canal and returned without having been opposed by aircraft. All planes were recovered. The only failure of the attack was that the battleships scheduled to interpose themselves between us and the enemy failed to arrive on time because they had mistaken the current off Cape Mala. This enabled the defending battleships to sink the Saratoga because we stood on to recover aircraft as a peacetime safety measure. Later, at the critique, Admiral Pratt described the action as the most brilliantly conceived and executed exercise in the history of the Navy, and made the trip north with us on the Saratoga to learn more about naval aviation. The subsequent history has, however, one important sidelight. Everywhere our carriers went in the Pacific, their tracks were dogged by Japanese tankers, one of which always seemed to be conveniently taking oil. From San Pedro, everywhere the fleet went, there were always swarms of Japanese fishing vessels. We learned that the Japanese feared our carriers more than anything else, and were feverishly building carriers themselves. There is no question that the yellow man copied the white man's tactics and learned to execute them brilliantly. What you saw in the Coral Sea and what we know about Midway is the culmination of this great transformation. Behind this brief sketch is the story of extraordinary development in every line, with great contributions by many others than those whose names I have mentioned. Behind it, too, is the story of the development of American aviation which was ready when the war came. In this letter, Mr. Wilson describes what was probably the first proper use of carrier forces ever attempted. This fleet problem formed the pattern for variations that were used in attacking other carriers at sea, attacking battleship, cruiser and destroyer squadrons, a consolidated fleet, and fleets of warships and transports in harbours. All this was, of course, tried in practice, but the Navy's practice tactics, worked out as carefully as if they were real battles, have proved to be right in every particular when our forces used them in Leh and Salamaua at Tulagi, against a Japanese fleet on last May 7, 1942 at Mishima, and on the following day, the finale of the Coral Sea conflict. Many exercises, of course, followed the fleet problem off the canal in 1929, and the earlier seaborne air raids on Hawaii in 1928. One of these came in April 1931, when the Lexington was called out of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, on an errand of mercy. An earthquake in Central America had leveled the capital city of Managua, Nicaragua, nearly 900 miles away. Medical assistance, supplies and serum were badly needed. At 30 knots, the Lexington made a 715-mile dash almost due west across the Caribbean. At 2:30 p.m. on April 1, 1931, while still 150 miles from the Nicaraguan shore, the carrier launched 5 planes carrying 4 doctors, 3 hospital corpsmen, 400 pounds of medical supplies, and 1,200 pounds of rice and beans. The airplanes flew the 370 miles to Managua, which is 220 miles inland, and at an altitude of about 2,500 feet on the Central American Plateau lands, in 4 hours. On April 2nd, while lying off Greytown, Nicaragua, the Lexington launched a second relief flight of 6 planes. All 11 airplanes returned to the Lexington the following day, and the carrier made the transit of the Panama Canal to the Pacific a day or so later. It should be pointed out that this launching of aircraft, heavily laden for operations from the sea to a point well over mountainous terrain, was almost a duplication of the war problem encountered when the Lexington's squadrons, this time carrying 1,000-pound bombs and 21-inch 1,750-pound torpedoes, flew up and over the jungles of New Guinea, threaded their way between the 18,000-foot peaks that dot the New Guinea highlands, and after 125 miles of cruising dropped down to blast a Japanese troop transport formation in the twin harbours of Lae and Salamaua. The Lexington was commissioned on October 3, 1927, her sister carrier the Saratoga having been put into service in April that same year. Their exercises since those dates not only enabled the Navy to evolve the carrier tactics that today make our fleets the most powerful in the world, but also they have had a profound effect upon all American naval design. For the carrier emphasized speed of the carrier itself, speed as the prime asset of its aircraft, and speed for the guardian and accompanying vessels. Range, too, suddenly became of vital importance, for most of the Navy's earlier vessels could be run completely out of fuel by the Lexington and Saratoga, just as the Omaha was run out of fuel by the Saratoga's long, fast circling dash toward the Panama Canal in the 1929 fleet problem. Earlier, American designs had been conceived around the battleship as the key vessel. Our battleships always had been relatively slow, with power and speed sacrificed to heavy armor and heavy guns. The battleships were supposed to be great heavyweights, much like heavyweight boxers, slow, lumbering perhaps, but with great stamina and ability to absorb punishment and a terrific sock in their 14- and 16-inch guns. With the advent of the carriers, all this was changed. The new cruisers had to be able to step with the carriers at high speeds for thousands of miles at a time, and so did the new destroyers. Speed began to be the goal for the entire fleet team. No summary of the carriers would be complete without reprinting the summation of some of the Lexington's firsts that were gathered by a group of us the night on which the great old ship finally sank. We foregathered in the wardroom of one of the smart new cruisers that had been doing plane guard with us throughout the Coralsea campaign. From the Lexington's own records that had been sent over before the crew was ordered off, we obtained the following information. From the day of her commissioning until she was sunk, the Lexington steamed 345,000 miles, or about the equivalent to 14 round-the-world voyages. Since the outbreak of war on December 7, 1941, she covered 43,311 miles before her end on May 8, 1942. She spent 112 days at sea following December 7th. During her career, 57,700 landings were made on her flight deck, and 4,700 of these were made between December 7th and May 8th. The first man to alight on her deck was Commander A.M. Pride. The last plane to alight was flown by J.E. Mattis, radio engineer, a petty officer's rating, who belonged to the ship's torpedo plane squadron. The Lexington had 9 commanders. Her first was Rear Admiral Albert War Marshall, retired, who was in charge of her fitting out following her launching in the fall of 1925. With the rank of captain, which he had held for several years, he took command on December 14, 1927, and held it until June 1930. Her last commander was Captain, now Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman, who took command on June 13, 1940, and fought her brilliantly through every war engagement in which she took part. It is perhaps noteworthy that every man who commanded the Lexington rose at least to the rank of Rear Admiral, and Admiral Ernest King, who was the Lexington's third skipper, is now Commander-in-Chief of the United States Navy. On the night of the sinking, I went scouting through the 800-odd Lexington men who were on that cruiser I mentioned earlier. I was trying to find someone who had been aboard the Lexington from the time she was commissioned to her end, and I finally found John B. Brandt, chief boatswain's mate, who had been assigned to aviation duties aboard her. For a special issue of the cruiser's paper dedicated to the Minute-Man ship, I had Brandt write a short piece he called Looking Astern. This special issue of the paper was for Navy personnel only and contains information that never has been officially released. But I am able to reprint here Brandt's story, which commenced with an editorial note that he reported as an apprentice seaman to the Lexington on December 8, 1927, and remained on duty in her ever since. He wrote, "When I reported to the Lexington, she was still not commissioned, but we soon put to sea from Quincy, Massachusetts. At that time I was just a taximan, one who assists pilots in taxiing their planes on the flight deck, but had the honor of pushing the first plane aboard up the deck. I am still assigned to the V-2 division. The planes in those first days were nothing to brag about, but I liked to fly anyhow. The rear cockpits of the T-3Ms, Martin torpedo planes of the 1927 era, were drafty, but the sightseeing was good. Commander Ellison, holder of the Navy's #1 pilot license, the ship's first executive officer, made his last and fatal flight from the Lexington's deck. He crashed at Washington, District of Columbia. This is not a history by any means. Perhaps I should tell of a couple of the high points in the Lexington's career. For instance, in the winter of 1929, the Pacific Northwest had a very severe cold spell. Because of the freezing conditions, the hydroelectric power supply of Tacoma, Washington, was cut off. Whoever thought of using the Lexington for such a job I do not know, but we steamed up there and tied up beside the Coleman dock. For 3 months her power plant furnished all the electric power that was needed for the community, with some to spare. That tremendous power came into play again in 1934, when it was decided to see what the old girl could do in a speed run. We left San Pedro, and 72 hours and some odd minutes later we were anchored off Honolulu. Perhaps my most vivid memory is that of the search for Amelia Earhart. Well, I remember it because it cut off a good liberty. It was July 3rd, 1937, and we had just anchored off Santa Barbara. The first Liberty Party was in the launch when word came to proceed on the search. We shoved off for San Pedro and took on some fresh provisions, then to San Diego for the squadron personnel. Before long we were in Hilo, Hawaii, where we got some fuel and additional provisions. For 27 days after that we covered 25,000 miles in the cruise. The chow was beans and more beans. The rationing was so strict that even the matches were doled out. Miss Earhart was not found. The dear old Lexington was first in everything. Every war game the fleet had, she came through in finding the enemy first. She set another first when on May 8th she became the first U.S. carrier to be lost in battle. It was hoped by the Lexington's officers shortly after the sinking that the crew could be held together and placed aboard one of the country's brand new carriers, which thus could become Lexington, Virginia, carrying on the name in another carrier. The hope of holding the crew together was based chiefly on the idea that a now almost completed new carrier could be renamed the Lexington. This project was dropped when the same yard that built the first carrier Lexington, the Fore River Yard at Quincy, Massachusetts, demanded the right to pass the name on to one of the new carrier hulls now building on its ways. The demand was made in the name of the workers at the yard in a telegram dated June 16, 1942, and signed by W. H. Horton, President of the Independent Union of Fore River Workers, and W. G. McDermott, Chairman of the Employee Members of the War Production Board. The telegram related that this new hull at the moment was merely designated CV-16. Secretary of Navy Knox granted the demand, saying that the yard workers promised all the speed and all the skill in our power in asking for the right. CV-16 had been earmarked for the name Cabot, but this will be given to a later ship of the same design, the Navy announced. The new Lexington will be one of the Essex-class carriers of 25,000 to 26,500 tons displacement and will carry more than 80 aircraft. She is due to be commissioned in 1943, the building having commenced in July 1941. It was impossible for the Navy to hold together the valuable veterans of the old Lexington to await a ship that will not be delivered until next year. Consequently, they are being given new assignments at sea that will split them among other carriers already commissioned, where their experience and skill will count immediately. Air operations aboard a carrier are undoubtedly the most spectacular flying done anywhere today. Remember that aboard the Lexington more than 100 airplanes were flown off and on, repaired, stored, refueled, rebombed and rearmed in an area approximately 300 yards long by 35 yards wide. The landings and takeoffs were made with a precision that required working to inches, and the penalty for mistakes was usually the loss of an airplane, over the side or a chewed tail or death from a whirling propeller. When the proper approach has been made an officer on the Lexington, while I was aboard, this responsible duty was in the hands of Lieutenant Aquila Dibrell, waves the incoming plane down. As it sinks to the deck and is seized by the arresting gear, it is immediately pounced upon by the plane-handling crews. The hook is released and returned to its retracted position by one man. Another, who watches this operation, signals to the pilot to open his throttle and rev up his engine, thus supplying taxiing power. 4 or 5 other men seize the wingtips and the tail and guide the plane on down the deck. The deck itself is painted off into various zones. In each zone there is a traffic signal man who takes over the control of each ship as it passes into his territory. These men stand to one side or the other. Their special duties are indicated by the colour of singlet and skullcap they wear. The plane traffic men wear yellow, for example. They beckon on or stop the pilot and signal the plane to be swept off to port or starboard, according to the stowing arrangements. These arrangements are always made according to a predestined plan. No matter in what order the planes came aboard, the stowing is arranged so that the big torpedo bombers, heaviest tactical airplanes operated off our carriers, are stowed at the stern. Next in line toward the bow are the dive bombers and scout bombers, which are exactly alike so far as their exteriors are concerned. The fighters finally are stowed far forward. The reason for this particular arrangement is twofold. First, the fighters might be needed for defense of the ship at any moment, and consequently have to be near the bow over which takeoffs are made. Second, the fighters, being the smallest and lightest planes in ratio to the power of their engines, make the shortest takeoff run. The scouts need a little more run for takeoffs, and the torpedo planes, when loaded, need as much as they can get. The actual alighting area takes up only the first 20% of the deck at the stern, about the first 180 feet. Planes touch down and roll to a stop in measured distances of 10 feet. Each landing is a full stall landing, and the hook picks up the arresting gear to bring the planes to an abrupt halt. Often this is accompanied by a screech of rubber tires and occasionally the collapse of a gear. This shock landing is one reason why Navy planes must be more strongly built than Army shore-based craft, though the additional weight distributed throughout the plane's structure reduces its performance. The ship's airplane elevators constantly take planes needing special service or overhaul down to the hangar decks, even while other craft are landing or taking off. At sea, most of the carrier's planes, and the Lexington carried more than 100 all told, are stored on the flight deck ready for immediate launching. The reserve craft are carried in the hangar decks where motors are changed and major repairs made. Takeoffs are as spectacular as the landing procedure. I marvelled constantly at the skill with which the deck-handling crews threaded their way amid the stored craft. Long before the takeoff, every engine would be waning up, its propeller flashing as the throttle was steadily opened up. Packed as tightly as they were on deck, there was only a matter of a foot or so between wingtips, tails, fuselages and propellers. The torpedo planes stand with wingtips folded over their back like so many seagulls until approaching the takeoff line. The other planes would be fitted in with wingtips overlapping. For both takeoffs and landings, of course, a carrier is turned into the wind. The air officer on the bridge has 2 flags, one white and one red. "Prepare to launch" is the order when he raises the red flag. The first plane is taxied into launching position and there waits, its pilot eyeing the bridge officer. When word finally comes from the captain to commence launching, this officer removes the red flag and substitutes the white. As soon as this is done, the control passes to the launching officer on deck, who steps forward with a small white wand in his hand. With a rapid, twirling gesture of the wand, not unlike the movements of a symphony orchestra conductor leading his musicians to the crescendo of a movement, the landing officer directs the pilot to open the throttle and rev up the engine. A glance down the deck to see that all is clear, and the wand points straight ahead, giving the pilot his clearance. The motor is opened full out, the plane begins to roll and the tail to come off the deck. Fighter, scout, bomber or torpedo plane make exactly the same kinds of takeoffs. They get their planes into flight position as quickly as possible and hold their wheels down until there is no more deck. The last few feet of the forward deck curve slightly downward, and ordinarily it is here that the plane is fully airborne for the first time. The same level flight is held for perhaps 300 yards to allow the plane to accelerate well above stalling speed before the first turn is attempted. A slight turn to starboard is made to get out of the track of the ship, and then once more the aircraft straightens out into the wind and climbs away to whatever duty it has been assigned. Immediately after the first plane has been moved into the starting line, the next plane in rotation begins to move up. By the time the first plane is over the bow, the second is in position and having its motor opened up. After half a dozen planes have gotten away, there is a steady line of planes taxiing up to the starting point and going off, which is the secret of the speed with which these operations are carried out. The torpedo planes, with wings still folded over the pilot's head, roll up to the takeoff line. As they arrive, the pilots start putting the wings down, and they are locked in place as the motor is revved up. This is done, of course, from inside the cockpit and without assistance of the deck crews. For the men on deck, this moving of planes is perhaps the most dangerous. Pilots must concentrate their attention on those directing the plane movements. Deckmen are expected to get out of the way. They duck beneath wings, avoid propellers, and work in hurricane blasts from the props of the moving craft with an agility and skill that is amazing to see. Until the Navy standardized landing and takeoff procedures a few years ago, each pilot made his approach and landing in the way that seemed best to him. In those days, pilots told me, there was a high accident rate, most of which, however, consisted of minor damage to airplanes. There is one classic carrier story they recounted, of the old-timer who made what he called the sneaking bird approach. This consisted of flying along only 10 to 15 feet above the wake of the ship until almost overhauling it. Then he would zoom the 35 to 40 feet up to deck level, come in just over the fantail and alight. "Why, Charlie," his brother pilots would tell him, "that is the craziest way of coming aboard I ever saw. It is backwards. It should not work at all." But Charlie always stopped such jesting by pointing out that he never had an accident and never damaged a plane. And because this was true, he was allowed to continue. The standardization, however, brought up the general level of accuracy to the point where a carrier landing today is routine with well-trained flyers. Every move from the moment the landing circle is entered is made according to a precision plan. This includes slowing the plane down to proper speed, preparing the engine, gear, hook and flaps at the right moments, and approaching at predetermined heights. All the time I was aboard the Lexington, for weeks prior to the Coralsea battle, and during the tense days and hours of the fighting, not a single accident occurred. The only time there was a crash landing, and on this occasion the plane hit the deck and then bounced off into the sea. The pilot had been wounded in the right shoulder by a Japanese bullet. This rendered his right arm, the stick hand, useless. This boy, Lieutenant R.F. MacDonald, and his gunner were fished out of the sea a few moments later by our trailing destroyer. 3 weeks later, his arm in a plaster cast, he came limping aboard the transport which brought many of us home and greeted me with high spirits. Today he is again well and flying. It happened that my quarters were in the Admiral's country, immediately under the flight deck and just ahead of the forward airplane elevator. The hinged steel flap, which covered the groove at deck level when the elevator was flush with it, was on the deck just above my cabin. Every aircraft that took off had to run across this metal flap, and each time there was a loud metallic whang as the flap slammed down on the steel plate of my ceiling. I used to lie abed, still half asleep, as the pre-dawn scout and fighter patrols took off. Even half asleep, I could count each craft, and finally I got to the point where I believed I could distinguish between the bangs made by different types. When I went down to the wardroom for breakfast, I could always tell just exactly how many planes had taken off. I won so many arguments on this point that finally my reports were accepted as official. "Is it too noisy for you there, Stan?" I was asked repeatedly. "Well, no," was the answer to it. "It is the same for the Admiral as it is for me." The point was that I was sleeping in part of the quarters occupied by Admiral Aubrey Fitch and his immediate staff, who made the Lexington their flagship. The pilots flew, did practice shooting, bombing and torpedo work almost daily. When not in the air, they were attending lectures, instruction classes and brushing up on navigation. This went for those who had 300 hours and for those with 4,000 hours. We actually had this range of experience in our flight personnel aboard the Lexington, and the same constant training routine, which would have been a grind, except that the men universally enjoyed their training, was applied to every other department of the ship. I used to spend a lot of time sitting on the various gun platforms gathering a suntan and watching the crews which were on duty at the guns for 24 hours a day. One thing that the Navy drives home to its anti-aircraft gunners is this: you must be ready every second because your opportunity for firing at an enemy aircraft is limited to the few seconds it is within range. Always expect the unexpected. On the Lexington's previous cruise, our ship had been attacked by 18 Japanese bombers, and the gunners had had the opportunity of shooting at live targets. They discovered the difficulties of hitting planes in flight. Their interest in learning all about gunnery and in training exercises had been sharpened. These boys were forever practicing ranging on targets, loading and firing and sighting. Our own airplanes, during daylight hours at least, were continually in sight, on patrol or other duties. The 5-inch gun crews, particularly, were forever practice firing on these craft. The boys themselves called the exercises, when no shots were fired, dry runs. They needed no urging from their officers, because enough of them had seen battle and understood the tremendous responsibility each gun crew shouldered. As a matter of fact, each crew out of its 12 hours of off-duty time daily spent 1 hour with a dummy loader down on the machine deck of the Lexington. A dummy loader is an exact duplicate of a 5-inch gun breech, with all the various loading appurtenances, including fuse setting, loading, and gun pointing devices. They used this to go through the continuous motions of pointing, setting shells, and loading. The purpose was to smooth out the teamwork and speed up the flow of shells to the breech in order to increase the rate of fire of the big guns. The crews used real shells and went through the whole sequence of loading, laying and firing as hard as they could go. They sweat buckets doing it, for a 5-inch shell and powder casing weighs 60 pounds and must be manhandled. It was strenuous sport, but it had the effect of working the boys into wonderful physical condition and built them into close-knit teams. The extraordinarily high rate of fire our 12 5-inchers put out when we were under attack later showed the improvements derived from all this training. All the gunners assigned to the light automatic cannon, 20mm and 1.1 inch, daily practiced to increase their accuracy by skeet shooting. Lieutenant Moore of the gunnery department explained to me that this was done to give these men the feel required for leading their targets. Shooting at a Japanese airplane, Moore said, is exactly the same as shooting at a clay pigeon. To hit it, you must fire well ahead because the plane is moving so fast. The secret of good gunnery, he believed, was to give the men plenty of shotgun work. To provide targets, spring guns tossed clay discs away from the Lex and the gunners, using shotguns, fired at them as they spun past. Moore used to show me the scores made by the young gunners, many of whom were new recruits, the first time at sea. A comparison of their first records to their last disclosed remarkable advance in marksmanship. In addition, they fired daily with their own weapons. Usually, the 5-inch guns were used to shoot time-fused flare shells up into the air, ahead of the Lexington. The shells would burst, throwing out a parachute from which dangled a magnesium flare. It would sink slowly downward. As soon as it was within range, the light weapons would open up on it in rotation. Inside of 2 weeks after leaving Pearl Harbor, these gunners were able to tear the small parachute to shreds, or shoot the flare to bits in a few rounds. This shooting was practice not only for the gunners, but also for the loading crews who fed shells to the gun breeches in clips of 5 and 10. During these shoots, the boys also practiced changing hot gun barrels and substituting various types of ammunition, tracer, armor-piercing, explosive, etc. A simple practice given the 5-inch gunners was to have one gun fire a shell set to burst at an unknown height and direction. The rest of the guns on the ship had the problem of ranging the bursts, calculating its height and timing their shells quickly enough to get several shots off before the smoke from the original shell was dissipated by the wind. As a special treat, every few days one of the scout planes would go aloft, and at the end of a 4,000-foot cable would tow a cloth sleeve target. It would be towed high, 10,000 feet or better, at first for the 5-inchers to shoot at with live shell. Then the towing plane would descend to levels where the 1.1-inch and the 20mm guns also had their chance at it. The same kind of daily gunnery practice was carried out by every ship in our force. Cruisers and destroyers would suddenly open up with their guns and shoot for perhaps an hour at a time. The first time I saw this, I thought surely the cruiser off our port quarter had sighted a Japanese aircraft. It fired a single shell, and then instantly afterward it seemed to break into flame from steer to stern as all its guns opened fire. The motto, "Fly, bomb and shoot," was vigorously carried out by the squadrons too. The scouts and fighter planes were constantly firing at towed targets. Almost every day we would drop a sled over the stern, pay out 1,000 feet of line, and tow it back on our wake where it bounced and skidded. On this small jittery target, the dive bombers and scout bombers laid thousands of light flash bombs in practice attacks. From the Lexington, we could see the accuracy of each dive and the flash of yellow light as the bomb burst either on the water or on the target. While the pilots dived and zoomed, coming in close to the Lexington or speeding away at water level, the gunners followed them with their pieces, making their own dry runs. Particularly did they follow the torpedo planes that made approaches on us without, of course, launching torpedoes. This emphasis on the torpedo plane attack paid off dividends in victories for the various gun crews as they shot Japanese torpedo bombers out of the air on May 8th. For every minute spent in the air, the pilots of the various squadrons spent from 5 to 10 minutes in classrooms setting up a problem and discussing its various solutions. These men were and are professional soldiers. They went at their jobs as a civilian does at his trade. Their purpose was destruction of Japanese airmen and ships, and everything dealing with the subject was of intense interest to them. Not only were they concerned with destroying the Japanese, but with the possibility that the enemy would reach them too. Theirs was a most dangerous profession, and woven through all their discussions were ideas for precautions or protective measures. They knew that every time they went out, some of them might not come back, but they wanted to reduce losses to the minimum that skill and efficiency could make them. Tactics for the use of their planes were often sketched out on blackboards exactly as a good football coach sketches out the plays for his team. They also sketched out the tactics likely to be used by the enemy and his counterstrokes to their blows. Many of these men already had been through 2 actions against the Japanese on earlier cruises. This experience plus information handed to the services from other ships and other pilots was all passed on to every individual. The purpose of these discussions was to prepare the pilots for instinctively correct action against whatever type of Japanese planes might be encountered or whatever kind of ground defenses might be used to hold them off. Although the destruction of Japanese planes was primarily one for the fighter squadrons, it was also important for the scouts, dive bombers, and torpedo plane pilots to be well versed in air combat. The latter groups had to expect to defend themselves against Japanese fighter attacks. Tactics had a part in these discussions, but most of all, gunnery efficiency was stressed. The leaders who headed the discussions repeatedly said, "There is no use getting a Japanese in your sights unless you hit him with your first burst, and keep on hitting him as long as you fire." To me, attending many of these lectures strictly as an observer, it was obvious that the Navy today has carried the old-time emphasis on good shooting in all its warships right into its air squadrons. Gunnery, the squadron leaders used to say, covers many a fault in execution of flying tactics. To gain their performance advantages, the Japanese have given up armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, the lecturers said. The Grumman F-4F fighters used aboard the Lexington had both these protective assets. In a knockdown drag-out fight, the Grumman will take more punishment than the Zero. This, plus our advantage in hitting power, balances out the enemy's superior points, they argued. The problem of the carrier fighter is very different from that of land-based fighters, the lecturers repeatedly explained. First, the fighter squadron is to the carrier what the belts of thick armor are to the battleship. They are the carrier's defense. Lost fighter planes and pilots cannot be replaced by the simple expedient of sending another plane and pilot down from a reserve pool. A ship leaves port with a limited number of planes which cannot be reinforced or replaced until it is again in touch with friendly shores. Every loss of a fighter plane and pilot diminishes the thickness of the carrier's armor plate. A shipboard fighter must fight with his head and must be a cunning, careful, calculating warrior. He must gauge the risk he takes in attack in relation to the menace to his ship. The number of fighters aboard any carrier can be and is varied widely to fit particular missions. The Navy's conception of the duty of a carrier fighter is primary mission, controlling the air over combat areas, destroying enemy spotters and other hostile aircraft, protecting friendly planes and vessels. Secondary mission, attacking enemy surface and subsurface craft, exposed personnel, and vital controls with machine gun fire, light cannon, or small bombs. Lectures for the torpedo plane pilots were among the most interesting I attended. These always took place in the wardroom between meals. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Brett, skipper of this squadron, held a scull practice as rigorous as the signal drills coaches give their football quarterbacks, except in this case every pilot had to take part. The stage used to be set by drawing up two of the long mess tables and bridging a 10-foot gap between them with specially cut light boards. Over these, Brett spread a painted canvas which represented the surface of the ocean. It was ringed in white bull's eye circles at scale distances indicating 1,000 yards. An arrow laid on the canvas indicated wind direction. Velocities and speeds of enemy ships were shown by numbered discs, and Brett also had a whole fleet of metal-scale models of the Japanese battleships, carriers, cruisers, and other vessels. The scale was such that a big carrier would be about a foot in length, with the use of models representing tankers, transports, supply ships, and warships. A whole enemy fleet train could be laid out on the canvas. Once this was done, Brett would call the pilots around him and say, "Suppose you wanted to attack that first carrier. Where would you lay the smoke screen, and where would you make your torpedo approach?" Several men would be invited to answer this question in turn. Each would give his solution and explain the reasoning behind his selections. Then a general critique would be held and ideas and suggestions from all the flyers given. Various phases of the problem would be discussed, including arrangements for timing the attack and the getaway for each plane. Pilots would have to go through the orders and directions they would give over the radio if they were in charge of the attack. This was just part of the program to make every man fit to command. Certain specific problems would be set up again and again, and reasons for various actions rehashed and re-explained. I recall that on the night of May 7th, after we had sunk the Japanese carrier Ryukaku near the island of Mishima, the torpedo plane pilots held a general discussion of the day's activity. The miniature ocean was laid out, and Commander Brett placed the Japanese fleet just as he and his pilots saw it when they began their attack. The fighters and dive bombers, in fact, every airman on the ship, crowded round, stood on benches to see over shoulders and listened carefully. The whole battle was reviewed, including the parts played by the dive bombers, in order to give those pilots who were not there a picture of the action and to clarify possible errors. Alternatives that might have been tried were discussed, and those elements correctly done were singled out and praised. Pilots reported Japanese defensive tactics. These were discussed, and conclusions concerning them were drawn. In this way, everything possible to be gleaned from air versus ship operations was absorbed by the men. Problems confronting torpedo plane pilots are quite different from those of the flyers who attack from above. The torpedo pilot flies a comparatively slow plane. He must come into the center of the enemy, and to within 1,000 yards of the ship he is to attack. He must stay close to the water because his torpedo would be damaged if dropped from too great a height. Basically, the torpedo plane pilot violates all the aviation precepts because he is a low, slow flyer. His problem is to get into position by a route that will give the enemy the least number of shots at him at angles and ranges that make the shooting most difficult. The dive bomber, on the other hand, comes screaming down from 12,000 feet or higher in an almost vertical descent. His problem is to get away after having dropped his bomb. In this, the explosion of the bomb, whether a direct hit or not, is a help to the bomber pilot. The blast, if anywhere near the target, disconcerts the gunners at the moment when the diving plane is at its most vulnerable point, the pull-out of the dive. Ordinarily, dive bomber pilots like to stay low and zigzag until they are clear of the enemy. I was surprised and delighted when I went aboard the Lexington to find that Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thark, who had been the fighter skipper on the previous voyage, had clipped an article of mine from the Chicago Tribune, written last year after coming out of England. It was an account in which I told of the ineffectiveness of anti-aircraft fire in Europe. Thark had been interested because it explained why such guns missed their targets most of the time. The gist of it was that ordinarily planes were within range of these guns for seconds only, and were gone before gunners had opportunities to correct their aim. Thark, who had led the Lexington's fighters at Leh and Salamaua, had reported after this engagement that my analysis was correct, and he had been using the article and its illustrations to make the same points with his pilots. Through this article I had become known to many of the Lexington's airmen before I came aboard, and as a consequence we had many discussions about the air fighting over England and the tactics used there. They were naturally interested to hear how their contemporaries in the Royal Air Force and Luftwaffe fought their battles, just as interested as I was to hear their accounts of the United States Navy, flyers versus Japanese airmen in the Pacific. Thus we were able to satisfy our mutual curiosity.